After the release of Resident Evil 6, there wasn't any sort of news on an upcoming Resident Evil game for about 2 years, but fans would finally get their first glimpse at the future of the franchise at Tokyo Game Show in 2014. Here, Capcom would announce that the team responsible for Resident Evil Revelations had been working on a sequel, Resident Evil Revelations 2. Interestingly though, the game wouldn't be a direct follow-up to the story of Revelations 1. Instead, Capcom explained at this event that the Revelations series would serve as a way to fill in the gaps between mainline entries and further flesh out the lore of the overall series for longtime fans. They also said here that they still felt that the future of the franchise was in the action horror sphere, keeping things focused on a larger audience, which is a statement that definitely aged well, but that since the Revelations series would be geared towards the hardcore audience, this subseries would give them the horror experience that they initially fell in love with. And the best part of this announcement was that fans wouldn't have to wait very long to get their hands on this new title, because Revelations 2 would be releasing in February of 2015, only 6 months after the initial announcement. So this whole thing was incredibly promising for fans like myself who had been playing the series since the PS1 days. But would it be able to live up to that promise and deliver a strong follow-up to what was easily the best Resident Evil spin-off to date? Well, let's talk about it. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Guys, you do not want to miss this because arguably the most well-known mobile game in the industry, Raid Shadow Legends, has just partnered up with Paramount to bring you the most radical crossover. All 4 of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, as well as April and Shredder, have been added to the game as legendary champions so that you can live out your nostalgic childhood fantasies. And I mean, just look at these guys. Leonardo has always been my favorite turtle, and he actually looks absolutely sick here. And if you log into the game for 7 days between now and November 21st, you can get Michelangelo, who's an amazing legendary champion great for spreading debuffs to your enemies, entirely for free. You can also collect the rest of the TMNT champions through limited time events, and I've been told that players who manage to collect all 6 of them get a special reward that's somehow even better than a good pizza. And if that's not enough for you, new players can also choose any one of these legendary heroes on screen by downloading the game through the link in the pinned comment and using their corresponding promo code. I would personally use code Monkey King to get Sun Wukong, but feel free to choose whichever looks best to you. Using my link will also get you a huge starter pack right off the bat, including the epic champion Tayrel, and you'll get another starter pack including even more free stuff and epic heroes after you hit level 15. So what are you waiting for? Raid has a genuinely endless amount of content, and they somehow keep adding new stuff all the time. The game is even cross-platform, so you can play it on your PC or your mobile phone, whichever one you prefer. I wish I had gotten all of these free heroes when I started out, so if you haven't yet, go down to the pinned comment and click my link below to get started today. Huge thank you to Raid for sponsoring the channel, and now back to the video. Resident Evil Revelations 2 is an episodic survival horror game developed and published by Capcom for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC in 2015. The game is set between the events of Resident Evil 5 and 6, opening with returning protagonist Claire Redfield attending an event for her new biohazard prevention agency, TerraSave. While at this event, we see her talk to a younger employee who's revealed to be Moira Burton, the daughter of the absolute legend from the original Resident Evil, Barry Burton. Shortly after meeting this character though, the event is suddenly raided by armed mercenaries, and all of the TerraSave employees that are there are taken as hostages. This leads to Claire and Moira waking up in a rundown prison on a remote island where all sorts of horrific experiments are taking place. And it doesn't take long for the two of them to find out that they've also been infected with a new, unknown virus. Those infected with this new virus are simply known as the Afflicted, and we also learn very early in the game that the virus will remain dormant in the host's body until there's a large spike in hormones produced by the body's fear response. So the virus will only actually affect a host who quite literally gives into their fears. Everyone who's brought to the island and infected is also given a monitoring bracelet that changes color according to their fear response, allowing those who are running the experiments to keep track of who has turned or who is about to turn. So naturally, the two of them escape from the prison and start trying to find their way off the island as well. But the catch is that the woman running all of these experiments is constantly monitoring them through the camera systems she set up around the island, as well as through the bracelets that she had installed onto them that actually allows her to speak directly to them. This is a damn good story setup, and one that had me immediately hooked both when I played the game on release 10 years ago, and even replaying it for this video now since I had pretty much forgotten most of the story here. It really feels like those running these experiments and controlling the island are nothing short of pure evil, and like you're just a little guinea pig in their sick game, giving us a pretty awesome premise to work with here. But Claire's story only makes up for half of the game's runtime, as the other half actually follows Barry Burton going to the island completely alone to rescue his daughter. And we bounce between these two stories a lot, with the entire campaign alternating between them with every chapter. But despite what you might think, Barry's story doesn't actually take place at the same time as Claire's. Instead, it takes place a whole 6 months later. At this point in the story, Claire actually managed to make it off the island and get word back to civilization, which eventually reached Barry over at the BSAA. But the catch is that Moira mysteriously didn't make it off the island with her. This sets up not only Barry's story as a one-man rescue mission, but also builds a lot of intrigue for the rest of Claire's story, as players will obviously be wondering how Claire made it off the island and Moira didn't. Not only that, but Barry also meets a small girl named Natalia shortly after arriving on the island, and players will immediately notice that Natalia has one of those monitoring bracelets that Claire and Moira had, except hers is showing a solid red color, which we learned in the chapter prior means some sort of mutation has taken place in her. So Barry's story chapters always following up Claire's with both the time gap and all of the different mysteries there are, set his story up to answer and reveal everything, while Claire's is there for the more traditional horror experience and escape story that longtime fans will know and love. Barry's chapters also pretty much always revisit areas from the chapter of Claire's that you just played prior, and the monsters in his story are almost all the result of the virus from Claire's story being left to run wild and evolve over the course of a few months. This is a fantastic setup for both stories and a great structure, but there's a big elephant in the room with this game that really ruined the structure for a lot of fans at the time, including myself. This being that Revelations 2 was released one episode at a time once per week, in the form of smaller individual purchases. Each episode consists of one chapter of Claire's and one chapter of Barry's, with each of them being about an hour apiece. So if you were playing this game as it came out, you were buying an episode when it released, getting about 2 hours of gameplay out of that episode, and then waiting another week for the next one. This structure wasn't exactly common at the time, but it was really popular for some games like Telltale's The Walking Dead a few years before this, though players were starting to get a little sick of it by this point, even when it came to things like Telltale's projects. This also led to the return of Revelations 1's previously on segments, the ones that felt really out of place in a single-player Resident Evil game. And while they do feel a lot more natural here, considering that playing on release would mean playing a little bit and then waiting a whole week before picking it back up, they've also added some next up on segments at the end of every episode to promote the next week's chapter and encourage players to come back and buy it once it's released. Except, now that the whole game is out and you can just play it in one go, those next up on segments are still there and now only really serve to slightly spoil the story right before you play it. This whole format was just so out of place and unnatural for a Resident Evil title, and while you can just simply buy the whole game at once and play it like normal nowadays, I can tell you from experience, having played through the game that way about 10 years ago, that it really sucked. As far as the story goes though, I don't have many specific thoughts on it aside from one very spoilery reveal about halfway through the game, but that doesn't exactly warrant a whole spoiler section. So suffice it to say that I thought the story of Revelations 2 was pretty good, but not really one that I love. It ends up going in some pretty fun directions, but the entire main plot of the game ends up centering around a character reveal who we're supposed to believe was in the background of the series the whole time, and we just never knew about them. But this reveal also feels incredibly contrived, as there's absolutely no way that we wouldn't have known about this character outside of any circumstance other than the writers only conceptualized this character as a means to connect Revelations 2 to the rest of the series. As without their inclusion, this game would feel like a very unimportant side story. And if you've played the game, you'll already know exactly who I'm talking about, and if you haven't, I've only very lightly spoiled you. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit more about the gameplay. Despite what the title may lead you to believe, Revelations 2 actually plays very differently from its predecessor, with things like the movement, shooting controls, and animation work either literally being reused or just having that same floaty feel that the first game did. Now, I give Revelations 1 a pass on these things because the game was developed as a 3DS title and only later ported to consoles and PC after it didn't sell as well as Capcom had hoped it would on the handheld market. But Revelations 2 was developed for consoles and PC, and the only handheld it was ever released on was the PS Vita, which was a re-release of the game after it had already been out for a while, so I'm not quite as generous with this one. I understand that this was a lower budget side game, I really do, but this game really does feel like it was developed with the intent of also being released on the 3DS with just how floaty it is. I'm of the opinion that when you're developing for consoles and PC, there's a higher expectation when it comes to those very foundational things like how good your controls feel. So them being so lackluster and floaty feeling in Rev 2 has always been a pretty big turnoff for me. The enemies in this game thankfully give much better feedback when shot during combat though, allowing for more consistent melee follow-ups and just a much better feel to the combat than Revelations 1 had. Rev 1's dodge move has even been moved to a single button that can be pressed at any time now, rather than being a button combo that you have to execute just as an enemy attack lands, which makes the game's notoriously tricky dodge a lot easier to execute. And even though I've played more than enough of Revelations 1 over the years to be really consistent with my dodging, I still think this is a good change just because of how frustrating it can be to actually learn the dodge in that game. There are also some smaller tweaks to the combat that might not seem super meaningful at first, but do go a super long way in bringing more of that horror into the third-person shooter era of the franchise. The first of these is that there's no inherent reward to killing enemies in this game, aside from just keeping yourself safe. No item drops to refill your health and ammo, no shiny currency that goes towards upgrades, nothing. Additionally, the player no longer gets any invincibility frames during their melee attacks, meaning you can't just brute force your way through groups of enemies by landing a quick headshot and initiating a melee strike like in previous games. Little changes like these really go a long way in making the game feel closer to the classic era Resi titles, which is a great thing considering old school RE fans were the stated target demographic of this project. And one of the biggest changes that Rev 2 makes to the formula is that you always have a set partner character alongside you, being Moira for Claire and Natalia for Barry, and you can swap between your two characters at any time with the press of a single button, much like what we saw way back in RE0. And this is actually pretty cool, as they've made these two characters in each respective half of their story play totally differently from the main characters. In Claire's campaign, Moira acts as the designated flashlight holder, as some gun-related trauma from her childhood has made her deathly afraid of even touching a firearm. She isn't totally useless in combat, as she does get a crowbar that she can use to attack enemies, but you're definitely better off using Claire's weapons. But while they might not be great in combat, the partner characters are very useful for finding items in the environments that you otherwise wouldn't be able to, much like what we saw in the first game with the Genesis scanner. For example, Moira can find hidden items by shining her flashlight around and looking for little glints of light that will reflect off of them. And once you've found them, you just go over and pick them up. The crowbar that she's been given also allows her to open up doors and crates that Claire otherwise wouldn't be able to, making her essential for opening up more of the environment, as well as finding additional resources and even rare upgrades. And when you're playing Claire, she'll even automatically shine her flashlight wherever your camera is pointed when controlled by the AI, which is just a really nice touch to make her useful for navigating darker environments, even when you're not actively playing as her. Natalia is, surprisingly, an even more interesting partner character though. She doesn't carry around a flashlight, and frankly doesn't need to since Barry has a tactical light attached to his vest. Instead, Natalia's main gimmick comes from her ability to sense the monsters through some sort of telepathy that even allows her to sense monsters that are otherwise completely invisible. This makes her incredibly useful for trying to sneak around monsters, or for dealing with those invisible ones, as the AI controlling Natalia will shout out directions at you when you try to aim at it, like a little more to the left or shoot now. And much like Moira, she's also integral to opening up more of the environment, as she's able to crawl through small spaces and access areas that Barry otherwise wouldn't be able to, and even unlock doors from the other side to allow him in. So she's really similar to Moira from a gameplay standpoint, but being able to telepathically sense monsters is way more interesting than just being the designated flashlight holder. So I definitely enjoy Natalia's presence in gameplay a lot more than Moira's. Now, these partner characters are actually really interesting since they're the first partners in the series who actually have different gameplay styles from the main playable characters. But they also bring up another one of the weirdest decisions that was made with Revelations 2. That being that this game is actually not playable in co-op, at least not online. See, you can play through the entire game in co-op with a second player, but you can only do this when playing locally and using split screen. If you want to play the game with a friend in co-op online, you just can't unless you play on PC and are willing to use some third-party applications to play the game in split screen. I would have loved to play this game in co-op and experience what it's like to have a real human being controlling the partner character for the duration of my playthrough. But doing so would have meant recording all of my footage for this video in split screen, so I just stuck to the single player experience, which I'm sure is the way most fans out there have played the game anyway. It's just really disappointing because I can tell that Revelations 2 offers one of the most interesting co-op experiences from the franchise, but the only way to actually experience that is by playing in local co-op, because despite implementing online co-op for the game's raid mode, they just never carried that functionality over to the campaign. Back to some more positives though, the progression in Revelations 2 is still really good. The weapon part system from the first game has been carried over here, and functions pretty much the exact same, with most of the parts you find even just being ones that they pulled over from Rev 1. On top of that though, they've also added a full skill tree to the game this time around, and I honestly can't believe that something like this wasn't in any of the prior action horror titles. You earn BP, essentially this game's experience points, from completing chapters with higher ranks, and then spend this BP in the skill tree between chapters to gain new abilities or just make your characters more effective. It's basically like RE6's skill system if it was way less grindy, made way more impact on your actual gameplay, and just generally felt more rewarding to unlock everything in. There's also still a great variety of weapons that you'll find throughout the campaign, so you'll just be making tons of progress in building up your characters the entire time you play, which really does make it easier to keep playing the game for longer periods of time. And probably most surprising of all, the devs have added some light stealth mechanics to the game, making this the first time that we would ever see genuine stealth gameplay in a Resident Evil title. It's really not much, simply allowing the player to crouch to reduce their visibility and footstep volume, and having a simple stealth takedown if you can sneak up on an enemy. But it feels surprisingly at home in a franchise like Resident Evil that was founded on things like resource conservation. It would obviously be nice if the stealth mechanics were a little more polished and fleshed out, but their inclusion definitely isn't something that I mind. Now, I saved this one gameplay complaint for last because it's probably my biggest gripe with Revelations 2. Instead of having a solid 50-50 split between open-ended exploration chapters and linear chapters like Rev 1, Rev 2 is just a totally linear game. There are no points in this game where you'll explore a large open-ended environment that you slowly open up over time as you solve puzzles and find key items, like a typical Resident Evil experience. Instead, you'll just enter a series of smaller areas that maybe have one or two puzzles or key items to find before moving on for the entirety of the game. This is completely fine on paper. I mean, it worked great for things like RE4 and RE5, but I've always found Revelations 2's level design to just be really boring. And I'm not really sure why either, because even though there are some solid puzzles here and there, I always find myself getting really tired of the way these levels are built after just a couple hours with the game. It probably has something to do with the fact that the whole game is built around the structure of walk in a straight line, then reach a slightly open environment and find a key item or solve a puzzle before continuing to walk in a straight line again. But I just find this game really monotonous to play through, despite the fact that it's only about 8 hours long in its entirety. And I just feel like every time I revisit this game, I'm most let down by the level design, because I actually do enjoy most of the core gameplay here. So overall, Revelations 2 has always been a weird game for me. There's a ton here that I really like, but there's a lot that I dislike here as well. And on top of that, while the environments and general tone of the game definitely lean more into the horror, this still feels a lot like Revelations 1 or RE4 when it comes to the gameplay, with the tension leaving pretty quickly once you actually get to grips with the game, and the whole thing just boiling down to an action shooter with a survival horror skin on top of it. It definitely feels a lot more grounded in tone than the other action horror games in the series, which is appreciated, but the gameplay doesn't really feel reminiscent of classic Resident Evil in the slightest, despite Capcom's promises before release. It's a game that I really want to like more, and I always revisit it thinking that I was probably too harsh on it the last time, but then leave feeling the exact same way after playing through it again. That being said, while a lot of my negatives with this game can be really frustrating, there are definitely a lot of areas where Rev 2 shines, and most of the things that I like about this game, I actually love. The atmosphere, the story, the progression systems, and the return of both Claire and Barry as protagonists are all awesome. But the floaty gameplay, the boring level design, and the lack of co-op play outside of split screen all end up dragging this one down a good bit for me. I do think this is a really solid entry in the Resident Evil franchise that I'm sure a lot of people love, but maybe just not one that's particularly for me, and that's totally okay. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil Revelations 2 a 7.5 out of 10. Hey guys, thanks for making it to the end of another video. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a sub, just anything to help me out with the algorithm a bit. I would really appreciate it. And I feel like I haven't mentioned this in a video in eternity at this point, but if you didn't already know, I do stream daily here on both YouTube and Twitch, and we just kind of hang out playing a variety of games, but especially the games that I do videos on, and recently I've been going for 100% completion in every single Resident Evil game, including the spin-offs, and it's been a pretty wild ride if that sort of thing interests you. We've got a really friendly community, so feel free to stop by sometime and say hi. Self-promotion stuff aside though, a huge thank you as always to the channel members and the patrons who give a much needed safety net to this whole YouTube thing and make series like this one realistically possible. Ad revenue can obviously be super up and down when covering the mainline games straight into the most obscure spin-off you've ever heard of, so it really does help out a lot and I can't thank you guys enough. With all that being said though, I'm going to let you guys get on with your day, so thank you once again for watching, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review. And a huge thank you to Raid for sponsoring the video as well, and a quick reminder that if you guys are interested in getting any of that promo stuff, you can check out my link pinned in the comments down below, as well as just in the description.